I caught a glimpse of her in the mirror when I was a child. The tall mirror towered over me. The frame had twisted bronze markings and was a treasured family heirloom, handed down from mother to daughter. I gazed into it every day to take in my reflection. She'd appear behind me, and I wasn't afraid of her. Her skin pale, long black hair trailed down her back, and she coiled it around a delicate finger. Her eyes were beautiful, with a timelessness, soft and gentle, framed by thick eyelashes. Her willowy frame was concealed with a mulberry-colored cloak and a thin white gown beneath it. I felt short and awkward compared to her, in my teddy bear pajamas, while holding a stuffed cat for comfort, and my grip tightened as I regarded her. With a flash, she smiled and disappeared, and I waited a while for her to return, to see if she would say something to me. I was left waiting, and finally, I decided to go back to bed to sleep. I don't remember what I dreamt about. I heard a feminine voice and soft whispers in the background. Yet, I couldn't understand what the lady from the mirror said. I remember I called out to her, asking her who she was and why she was speaking to me. I received no answers. When I told my mother about what happened over breakfast, she told me I'd been watching too much television and playing too many video games. That day, I hadn't, but I wasn't going to challenge what she was telling me. She told me she would set up a play date for me with the neighbor's children, a group that didn't like me, and I didn't like them. I told her I didn't want to, but she picked up the phone, called other parents, and ignored my protests. I looked back to the mirror, hoping to see her watching me, so I could show her to my mother. All I saw was my hopeful and then disappointed face. I waited until bedtime for my mother to head off to bed, so I wouldn't be disturbed. I climbed out of bed, tiptoeing over the toys lining the floor, and walked to stand in front of it. I ignored the chill in the air, and walked toward my mother's closed door, listening for any sounds of her waking up. Nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief and returned my attention to the figure inside the mirror. I saw her standing there, looking at me, and I felt her standing behind me with a hand on my shoulder. She smiled warmly at me, and I touched the reflection with my fingertips, only to find it soft, rather than the hard surface I expected. I yelped, yanked my hand backward, and held it in the other, checking it to ensure I could feel it, that it was still mine. "Who are you?" I whispered, my breath forming a mist on the mirror's surface, as if the lady in the mirror held the answer to my most profound question, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The figure in the reflection lowered herself down to my level. The lady's eye level was so close to mine, and her hand beckoned me to lean closer to the mirror. Something inside me told me to be cautious, that it was a bad idea. I don't know why I decided to do it. Curiosity, a desire for approval. I'm not sure. Either way, I leaned close to the mirror. "You have found me," she said, her voice soothing. I couldn't help but be taken in by her eyes. "Don't worry, I will protect you, but first, I must test you." Her eyes glinted with a vibrant orange hue as her hands landed on my shoulders from behind. She donned a golden garland, a crown of victory, exuding an unmistakable air of authority. I noticed the lady in the mirror's gaze darken and move past me. I heard my mother's bedroom door open behind me, followed by a loud scream. I turned to look where the sound came from, feeling hands on my shoulders that gripped tightly, and then they released. My mother ran toward me, wrapping her arms around me and holding me close. She pulled me away from the mirror and fell on the floor with me in her arms. I tried to ask her what was wrong, but she crawled away from it and dragged me in the process. What was that? Couldn't you tell it was there?" she demanded, the whites in her eyes showing fear. My mother took my face in her hands. She stared at me with her eyebrows narrowed, moved my head from left to the right, then from the front again, and seemed to be looking for something. She never told me what it was. The panic clearly rose within her. Her hands trembled, and she kept examining my face once I managed to pull away. "What's wrong? Why did you do that to me?" I demanded, trying to pull myself from her reaching grasp, and after a moment, she released me. She was panting heavily, a hand resting on her chest, and finally, she moved and slowly stood up between me and the mirror in the hallway. "You didn't see it?" I shook my head. Her voice quivered as she recounted what she had seen. "It was a monster, a demon, or perhaps a djinn. It looked more like a demon, bright red with large horns." "How didn't you know it was there?" I debated telling or reminding her of who I had been speaking to. "I know what I saw." Her face is now forever etched into my memory. She was beautiful. Indeed, my mother had to be wrong. "I was talking to the lady in the mirror." "You must have seen something else," I answered, guilty but unsure why. She closed her eyes, gave a bittersweet smile, and exhaled slowly. My mother seemed resigned to some reality I didn't know. My mother warned me to avoid it, and covered it in a thick blanket, so I couldn't see my reflection. Her behavior became more erratic. She started pacing around at night, and placing small bags around the doors and windows. I saw her praying on her knees, candles burning around her, and I couldn't understand what she was saying. I have never seen my mother behave like this before. We were never a religious or spiritual family, so her sudden strange behavior was disturbing to me. She would make several phone calls to people I did not know, and spoke in hushed tones. I once caught her doing this, and saw her quickly hide her phone when she saw me watching her. Late at night she would curl up in bed, crying in the fetal position, while holding onto a pillow so tight that her knuckles would turn white. She would remain in this state even during the day, isolating herself from everyone. The friendly mask she used to wear fell away, and there were no more pleasantries. I'd go in and ask her what was wrong, or try to offer her a sandwich to eat, but she refused every single time, and I watched her wither. Usually, I wouldn't have done this. I picked up the phone and called my grandma, a prim and proper woman, challenging to be around, and yet could always be relied on. I told her mum was in bed and hadn't gotten up in days. She told me to hand the phone to my mum, and I told her she saw something behind me. My grandmother stopped her harsh demands and asked me more gently what had happened, and I told her. She was silent. She told me to look after my mother and not let anyone else inside the house, no matter what they said or how demanding they became. I said okay, and she told me not to worry. She would be over soon. I was left even more confused than I was before. I heard a knock at the front door, went and looked through the peephole, and went to tell my mother that 2 people were waiting outside. She was staring into space, a long line of drool from the side of her mouth, and she didn't respond to me. I remembered my grandmother's words, but they kept knocking. This time, they reached out to the lunar door knocker and repeatedly struck it. I looked through the peephole to better see them, and saw the 2 people more closely, a man and a woman. They were physically unremarkable and forgettable, standing there impatiently in their clothing, grey slacks and jackets, and nothing stood out. Their pair both had a turned-up top lip. She tisked and knocked repeatedly again, expecting to enter. I was tempted to go into another room to hide, but felt unexpectedly bold that day. I opened the door indignantly. "Can I help you?" I kept it almost closed. The chain offered protection if they tried to burst inside. And the woman leaned down, a condescending smile on her lips. "Hello, little girl. How are you today?" She leered. We both knew she wasn't genuinely interested in my well-being, and her pleasantries were a waste of my time. The man beside her rolled his eyes, checked his watch, and sighed impatiently. "Fine." "Aw, aren't you sweet? Can we come in? Your mother has been expecting us," she asked, put her hand on the door, and glared down at me. I knew she was lying. I hated that stupid, condescending smile on her face. It was one thing that stood out to me all these years later. I couldn't escape the uneasy feeling the pair were giving me. No, she didn't tell me you were coming, and I don't know who you are." "We're friends." I hated how she emphasized the word. I didn't know her, or the idiot that was with her. "No, please leave. You're not welcome here," I said, closing the door. The strange woman reached through, grabbed the door frame, and wouldn't let me close it. I was happy to be rude to someone like this, but physically hurting someone was utterly different. "No, don't you dare. You need to let me inside, or your mother will be angry with you." Her face was disturbingly close. I thought I might slam her nose in the door, and she reached inside, opened the clasp, and sharply pushed open the door. There was a sickly smell when they entered. I coughed and backed away. Some kind of herbs I didn't recognize. I didn't know it then, but I would see these two many times in the future. Not that I wanted to. "Get out!" I gasped as they shoved me against the wall, leaving me winded and struggling to grab her jacket as she went by. They ignored me and strode toward my mother's bedroom. Before I could do anything else to stop them, they entered the room, closed the door, and I heard the lock click. I struck the door several times with my fists, trying to get it to open up again. I hit the door with my petite frame, in a foolish attempt to break it open. I knew they'd kill her, so I ran to call my grandmother. I knew I should have called the police, but my grandmother, in my eyes, was nearly a godlike figure. I sat curled up with my phone, hiding as far away as the curly cord would permit me to, and listened to it ring. She took a little while to answer. My words were rushed, telling her in tears what happened, and if she could get here soon. Again, maybe I should have called the police. She told me to hide in my bedroom, lock the door, and not to speak to them. I kept asking her who they were. My grandmother wouldn't tell me. I hid in the closet, waiting, and I heard my mother screaming from her bedroom. It sounded brutal and animalistic. Maybe I should have called the police. However, that wouldn't have helped. I opened the door and went out into the hallway. A dark, unnatural light flowed beneath my mother's door, and the screams became more desperate. I had to do something. Anything. The blanket still concealed the mirror, and I stared at it. It looked like a tall Grim Reaper standing there. Guided by an unseen force, I pulled on the blanket, and it fell to the ground. The lady in the mirror stood like she had been waiting for me. This time, she wasn't dressed in softer clothing. Instead, she was dressed in armor and prepared for battle. I never saw her like this before. Her chest plate had a roaring lioness, a circular shield in her left hand, raven-hued hair braided down her back, and a long spear in her hand. She rested the shield on her legs, leaned down, and extended her hand out of the glass, waiting for me to accept. I stopped, hesitating, and remembered my mother's words. It would take my grandmother some time to get here. My mother's terrified scream from the bedroom gave me the incentive I needed to continue. I reached out and took her freezing cold hand in mine, gently pulling it, and she stepped through. "Stay here," came the whisper. A gentle command I obeyed. The lady in the mirror traveled through the locked door in the mist. Not bound by the physical barricade, I waited on the other side and heard the malicious screams, pleads, and fingernails trailing down the doors. Each one sounded more brutal than the last. I smiled when I heard their cries and pleas, and finally, the noise died. An uncomfortable stillness took hold. The door lock clicked, and it creaked open slowly. The sight before me was a bloodbath. The pair had their skeletons cut brutally from their necks, leaving nothing but two bloodied severed heads. Well, plus two necks to allow them to stand. The skeletons, in defiance of science, twitched. Their eyes moved from one to another, terrified, and they tried to move. They tried to scream, but only rasping sounds came out instead. I thought the lady from the mirror would kill them, and they had gotten hurt, but I didn't expect this. I have yet to find out what happened to their skin, muscle tissue, and organs. The lady in the mirror took them for her own purposes, whatever they were. My mother finally peered out from under the sheets. Her hands had been degloved, and the skin was nowhere to be found, revealing the bones and reddened flesh. One of her eyes was missing, a bloodied pit all that remained, and I couldn't see the rest of her injuries at the time. She didn't behave like she was broken or in pain. She had a light-hearted, even happy smile, and I cautiously approached her, stepping over the bloodied pieces of flesh and bone. except it was feeble, and after admitting defeat, I casually strolled through it. It made a rank squishing sound with every step as I tried not to slip up. I sat on the edge of the bed, on the side closest to her. I remember not knowing what to say to her. I would have understood if she had screamed for help, but she was happy, too caught up in the moment. Her amber-colored eyes were filled with happy tears. I had to resist the urge to wince when her hand reached out and took my hand. Her hand was moist, and the fresh meat was uncomfortable. I could smell the blood around us, and I dreaded the time it would take to clean the room after what happened here. She is back. Things will be better for us now. My mother beamed, smiling at nothing. You dragged me away from the mirror and wouldn't tell me what happened. I responded. What? The lady in the mirror also visited me when I was a little girl. You'll see. You'll see. Things will improve for us. I was even more confused. You told me you were scared. You told me some blood-colored demon was standing behind me, I demanded, and already she was drifting off into space. She released my hand. I went into the kitchen to get the first aid kit. I knew I couldn't call the police to explain what happened, and hoped none of the neighbors had. I figured there would be only two people who would be blamed, either my mother or I. So I returned to the room. My mother hummed and sang to herself, while swaying her hands to music I couldn't hear. It was challenging to smear antiseptic cream on her hands while she did so. Awkwardly, I did my best to bandage them, and finally, it was wrapped up as best I could. I placed a rolled up piece of cotton wool inside her eye, wrapped her head while she flailed around, and tried to ignore the two heads when they laughed at me. It was late afternoon when my grandmother finally made it. I heard her knock 3 times, and she entered our home. I ran to meet her and left bloody footprints along the way, and she frowned at the sight of them. Are you and your mother okay? She asked me, taking me by the shoulders. They hurt her. They took the skin off her hands. I panicked. She tisked at me and kissed my forehead. Go take a bath. Never let me catch you running around that filth again. Go, get changed, she demanded. She was tall. Her grey hair was coiled in a tight bun above her head. She wore a tight business suit and pink lipstick that no longer suited her. I don't think I've ever seen her smile. I obediently went into the bathroom, turned on the shower and bathed. I can't remember how long I was in there, scrubbing away both the gore and the memories of what occurred. The blood and grime washed away. Unfortunately, the memories had already taken hold. The situation finally sank in. I tried to focus on the feel of the water on my skin, put on clean pajamas, and went out to see my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Sit down. I want to talk to you about this when you are older. However, the present means we must. I pulled the stool over, sat and held the warm mug. I sipped it, and my top lip was coated in foam. I wanted an explanation. I needed an answer. Your mother and I come from a long family tree of witches. It is our birthright, and our bloodline is ancient. I don't mean Salem, the ones you see on TV, and even those who think they have the ability. She rolled her eyes, held the mug, and eyed me like a hawk to gauge my reaction. I had already seen some strange things, so this wasn't the worst thing I'd encountered over the past few days. We keep it a secret. There are spirits, demons, gods who assist us, some who will hinder us, and she lifted a large pot with the 2 heads inside. They were gagged and barbed wire tightly wrapped around to keep it in place. They had tears down their cheeks that would never be washed away, leaving permanent dark lines. And there are witch hunters who try to fuck with us. My grandmother spat the words venomously, a triumphant look on her face. Who is she? I asked softly. My grandmother asked. The woman in the mirror. Who is she? I asked, still unsure about her. Ah, the lady in the mirror. Our beloved guardian, and some would say our ancestor. It doesn't matter. Either way, she's been part of our lives for a long time, and will be part of yours. I didn't answer, so she continued her history lesson. Other names of hers include the Dark Lady and the Queen of Night, as well as many other names and titles. She'll protect and aid you. When did you start seeing her? Not long ago. I saw the lady in the mirror a couple of days ago, and since then, everything has changed. Is my mom okay? Slightly concerned that she didn't mention her. My grandmother waved her hand. Oh, she is fine. Her wounds will heal faster than she thinks. If you had have waited, she might not have been so fortunate. She gave me a brief, treasured smile of pride, and her expression returned to the aristocratic one of disdain. Can I go see her? No. Stay with me. She is sleeping anyway. My grandmother answered and pointed to the witch hunters. The lady in the mirror has blessed us with this offering. They now belong to us. Their souls are ours to torment, and you may do something to them if you like. I knew deep down it wasn't a request but an order. I stood up. The two heads watched me fearfully and quivered to try to get me to go away. They gave muffled screams and grunts of irritation. I poked one of them in the eye, then rushed back to my seat and heard my grandmother's obnoxious, disappointed snort. It felt like she had stabbed me, and I turned to look at her with red cheeks of embarrassment. They tried to butcher and kill your mother, and you just poke them in the eye. Do something, she demanded sharply. She glared at me, coldly, and waited. Before now, I had never been encouraged to do anything violent. I didn't think I was capable of it. Despite what they had done, I felt sorry for the witch hunters and wondered what we had done to their families. The look on their faces still haunts me to this day. Then I remembered my mother's lost eye and butchered hands. I stood up, walked to one of the kitchen drawers, opened it and took out a teaspoon. My grandmother leaned back, her arm resting on the back of the kitchen chair, and watched me. I held the witch hunter woman by the back of the head, took the spoon, and drove it into her eye, pulling it from her skull. Adequate. And remember, they can't die now. You did a good job, and I'm sure they were planning something equally horrific for you, she continued, staring down at the newspaper in front of her, focusing on the sections relating to crime, unwilling to change her ways for anyone. Scrutinizing things online? Absolutely not. My grandmother made arrangements to move into the house, and from what I knew, my mother wasn't consulted about the decision. She was grateful for the added protection in the house. At least, that's what I thought. Over time, my usually nervous mother became relaxed. Her hands and other wounds healed. However, no magic could return her missing eye to her. She disguised it with a leather eye patch. The house changed. Herbs were hung up along the windows, and a statue of the Queen of Night was flanked by 2 tall white pillar candles on either side. I felt the statue's eyes following me, and no other witch hunters came to the house. I remember seeing one person peering through the windows at night. My grandmother took one of the heads by the hair and held it out for the person who fled, never to return. We would offer the Queen of Night, the lady in the mirror, pomegranates, grapes, and oil. I would wake up to either my grandmother's or mother's chanting. The statue always glowed, and I felt my soul begin to relax. I started getting messages from her in my dreams, scenes of ancestors from and before recorded history. Some I knew, and many I did not. I had no idea how large my family indeed was. It was difficult to tell the difference between them. My lessons became more intense, with my grandmother taking the lead. She pulled me out of school and began homeschooling me. I received enough education to please the Board of Studies, but my focus was on protecting myself and learning the ways of the witch in our history, which was a task in itself. I was being prepared for a battle that would one day come. None of the mirrors were covered anymore, and we gained many more that were placed all over the house. And when I'd walk past, I'd glance inside to see images of what she was doing. I wanted to reach out to her. Soon, you will carry my sword for me, and you will defend our kind in my name. I heard her whisper. The lights were off, her presence warm and welcoming. I couldn't see her then, but I knew she was there, and felt her presence. You need to train and be ready. Do you understand me? She asked, and I could feel her smile. Yes, I answered. A feeling of growing dread gripped me. I don't think I can do it. Your bloodline is one of 3 that remain. Witches are nearly extinct. You have 2 options. Either you need to have many more children, or... She let it hang in the air. I wondered who the other families were, and in later years, I met them and worked on a fragile alliance between us, one that could break at any moment. Since I was a child, the thought of having children was out of the question for many years. My grandmother was simply too old, and my mother was too brutalized to conceive more. The 2 talking heads, the witch hunters' minds were slowly warped, and they became our guardians. They turned to stone, resembling statues that would whisper warnings to us. Their voices would echo through the house, alerting us to the presence of wicked spirits, or other witch hunters who came too close. My grandmother said there were good spirits inside them aiding us, yet I wasn't so sure. When I reached 15, I was initiated into her service. I can't tell you the rites, and if I did, both of us would die. All I can say is, I never realized there were so many worlds around us. I traveled to the realm of the gods. I floated, and was guided by my grandmother's and mother's whispers. I saw my reflection in a large pool. The water glowed and rippled slightly. I wanted to reach out to touch it. A man who I trusted on site approached me, placed a finger against his lips to encourage my silence, and held a dagger in his hands. He took one hand and then another, slicing both palms, starting from my wrists to the fingertip of my middle finger, and the blood started to trickle down from the wounds. They stung. I looked into his eyes. He had wrinkles around them, and I remembered his warm smile. I was given the option to go anywhere in this realm I desired. The freedom offered was beyond what I experienced in my everyday life. I was floating through a thick forest. When there was a gap in the tree canopy, I saw a full moon and trees in an unblemished night sky. The air was crisp, and vivid green surrounded me as a gentle mist surrounded us. It was complicated to navigate through due to the dense foliage. Enormous tree roots covered the ground with a small amount of leaf litter. Green moss clung to the thick tree trunks, and coarse bark decorated the frame, each with its own story. I saw her walking through the trees, her back facing me, and her hair trailing down her back. Occasionally, she glanced back to look at me. "Are you ready?" she asked. "No," I answered honestly. I stumbled, trying to find my way through and becoming dizzy. The world around me spun. I saw horrid faces screaming and whispering at me, a mess of contorted voices that were relentless in their torment. Hands reached out to grab me, pull at my hair and pinch at my skin. I woke up gasping with my grandmother and mother seated on either side of me, surrounded by candles and incense smoke in the air. Thin tendrils spiraled up in the air as I lay on my back, gasping. "What happened?" my mother asked, concerned. Her sole eye glanced at my grandmother for guidance. She asked if I was ready. I answered, breathless, and rubbed my sore limbs. They were already bruised, but I was starting to get feeling back in them again. And the cold demand came from Grandma. I told her I wasn't. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. I glanced at my mother first, studying her face. She looked down at her hands, worried. My grandmother's face held the typical stern expression, which, too, became one filled with concern. She exhaled, and for the first time, I saw her defeated. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting up and looking at them both. "You are the second one to fail in her training," she answered softly, then reached out to place a comforting hand on my mother's. "Only I've been able to learn the high mysteries, and when I die, it means you and your mother will be defenseless." I didn't realize my decision had such a permanent result. "No one told me. Is there anything I can do? Can I tell her? Can I retake the test?" I asked, looking from one to another, hopeful. "You'll have to ask her." I didn't like the way she said that. "If you fail a second time, you'll lose her favor and protection. Given your bloodline, you will be defenseless. We have many enemies, and you need to protect yourself. Can you speak to her?" My grandmother shook her head. "This is between you and her. No one else can intervene on your behalf. She paused. It is over. Either you are successful in this, or you need to have children, and that is not ideal. Not yet, anyway. I hated this conversation. When do I try again? You'll need to serve the lady in the mirror every day and night to show your loyalty. Your studies are solely on this part of our life. Your mother tried to protect you from your fate, your past and birthright, and it may be ultimately what gets you killed. I hated how she said this in front of my mother. The following day, my grandmother woke me up before dawn. It was still cold and dark, and the chill of the night lingered. I crawled out of my bed, washed and dressed in a white chiton, with a slender rope around the waist as a belt, and under the watchful eye of my grandmother, I lit the 2 pillar candles, placed the fruit on her offering tray, and peered up at the statue. Since I refused, she hadn't come to me in my dreams anymore, and I no longer felt her around me. I recited the prayers, gazing up at the statue in reverence, but there was no recognition, no whispers. I missed the lady in the mirror. My grandmother was plagued by nightmares. The Queen of Night sent her multiple warnings of events that were coming if we didn't act swiftly. However, there was no indication of what we should do to make it happen. I got up without an alarm and conducted the rites. They had become second nature now, and the house was deadly silent. I heard my grandmother's bedroom door open. That morning, she looked drained, ancient for the first time, and had dark circles under her eyes. She drained the kitchen sink, not saying anything to me, and kept her back in my direction. It has started. You have to take the blood pledge tonight, she insisted, and I stood beside her. Outside the kitchen window, I saw shadow figures on the front lawn, creeping around and peering inside. They couldn't make it in, and jolted backward from the doors and windows. I gave her a questioning look, then noticed how sickly she truly looked, and her veins pulsed. Poison moved through them, and I wondered how long she had been suffering. I hugged her and could feel her bones. She hesitated and fell into my arms while I held her. I remember how sad I felt and longed for a more innocent time. My grandmother had to lie down to rest, and I had time to speak with my mother. Don't make the same mistake I did, she sighed, roughly mixing several protective herbs in a large bowl. A different large bowl was pushed toward me. I dragged it the remaining way and kept mixing. I didn't interrupt her and waited for her to continue. I hated our life, my mother admitted. I didn't mind serving the Queen of Night and living simply. But battle? Actually killing people? I couldn't do that. But neither of you have killed people, right? She paused, stared at me with her soul eye and smiled. Not people, demons and spirits. In honesty, what happened to the witch hunters is nothing compared to what we had to do. I wanted to spare you that. What happened to make the Queen of Night turn away from you? I asked curiously. I refused to kill. The grim words gripped me. Kill an animal or a person? She looked at me cynically, and I knew what my mother meant. A person. I hadn't killed before. The idea made me feel dirty, and she leaned close in to comfort me. I'm not going to judge you for whatever decision you make. I asked the lady in the mirror for you to have the freedom to choose, and that is ultimately up to you, she answered, and I felt even more guilty over the circumstances. What's happening with Grandma? I've never seen her like this. Is she sick? It's better for me to show you. She took my hand and led me into my grandmother's room. Together, we saw her on her knees, rocking back and forth, whispering to herself, and surrounded by a thick row of candles. I recognized some of what she was saying. All the power, and thus, the responsibility was burdened on her alone. Akin to oxygen, unless your body processed it correctly, it would age you and cause you to suffer. I learned about this process years later. I knew this wasn't how I wanted to live. It was dusk, and I bathed, dried and cleansed myself, coating my body in her oils, and lay in the circle. I was surrounded by candles, the flames vibrant from the storm's energy, and I knew it wouldn't take long for them to work. My mother knelt on one side, and my grandmother winced when she lowered herself to sit with me, guiding me through the ceremony. We made all the necessary offerings, hoping the Queen of Night would hear our plea and accept. We needed her to. I closed my eyes, and instantly, I was back in the same forest I had been inside. This time, the mist was dense. I could barely see the trees, and only the faintest outline of the moon was visible through the canopy. Her eyes glowed a faint white that turned into a vivid yellow, and I stood before her, naked and waiting. The motherly aspect of her had gone, and I knew I was already testing her mercy by being here at all. I stood, circled by tree roots, and waited for her to approach. I now realized the difference in her dual sides. The Lady of the Mirror was a protective spirit, an ancestor, and a guide who would aid us, while the Queen of Night was a ruler. We were her servants, and she expected us to obey. She stood before me, shrouded in the moon glow. Her face betrayed nothing, and a hand was offered. I wasted no time and accepted. "Do you know what you have to do?" she asked. Her black hair swirled around her. "Yes, I accept and will do whatever you ask." Her eyes closed, and we were transported to a typical suburban home. 3 generations of a family were seated at a kitchen table. A son, father, and grandfather. They were the same age as my family members. I'm sure the teenager was the same age as me. I'd never seen these people before, and it mimicked my family. Are they a rival witch family? No. Are they witch hunters? I was desperate for a reason to kill them, to justify it in my mind. The concept of killing a wrongdoer, or people actively hurting my family, made sense. Slaying innocent people? I didn't like it. I never asked her. I suspected it was punishment for not complying the first time. My gaze moved from them to her, and back once more. "How do you want me to do it?" I inquired, resigned to my fate. The Queen of Night opened her hand to reveal a dagger. It was beautiful, silver, and it glowed from hilt to tip. I could feel its power radiating through my hand when I accepted it. I held it in 2 hands, palms up, with the blade between them. "Are you sure? Is there any way you wish for me to do it?" As her hand reached out to them, I desired to please her, and the guilt slowly washed away. I held it ready. The father and grandfather couldn't see me. I could see my reflection in the teenage boy's eyes. I was a walking corpse. I didn't wait. I drove the dagger into the neck of the grandfather, holding him by the hair, and the father jumped up, lifting his son to protect him from the unseen force. I stabbed several times to ensure he was dead. His hands on mine. His legs kicked violently, and he choked, struggling to breathe. The blade bore through skin and bone. By the time I was done, it barely clung to a single strand of skin. I released him and allowed his body to slip onto the floor, making my way behind the father and son. He had a knife in his hand, darting around and unable to see where I was. I never expected to have such vulnerable prey. Uncertain whether or not I'll be struck down in this form, I took no chances. I sidestepped him, held the father's armed hand to protect myself, and ran the blade across his throat, both suffocating him and causing him to bleed. He blinked and whimpered, his final gaze on his son, and the knowledge of what his failure had cost him. I felt his tears on my fingers, nearly stopping me in my tracks. I turned to the teenager. He didn't run. He didn't plead for his life or say anything. He simply stared at me. I hated seeing my reflection in his eyes. Was this what I always was, or what I had to become? I stabbed him repeatedly, closing my eyes and zoning out. When I was done, he stared up at me. "Bring an eye home for your mother," the Queen of Night bid me. Using the dagger, I plucked out the intact eye and held it in my hand. It was coated in blood, and turned to face her. I bowed my head in reverence, trying not to think about what I had done. Is there more for me to do? An uncomfortable silence passed. On either side of my body, I heard whispers from my grandmother and mother, and I hoped they wouldn't try and pull me out. I needed to continue. You have passed the test. Your grandmother's burden is now one you will have. Keep yourself safe, and make sure you have children of your own someday. The Queen instructed, and I listened. You will be called on to complete more tasks in the future. I awoke in my body, the change felt, and my dreams returned to me. I saw the lady in the mirror again and received her comfort. My mother removed her eye patch and blinked. However, the eyes were both different. The boy's eye always watched me skeptically, retaining a life of its own. The stone heads warned us of the approach, and I drove them away with my words and gestures. My grandmother continued to wane. First her body began to go, and finally her mind went with it. The formerly indomitable woman would sit on the porch in her wheelchair, wrapped in blankets to protect her from the cold, and mumble to herself. We ate our meal in the garden, and she passed under the moon's glow and was taken in by the Queen of Night. I saw her spirit rise. The image flickered from when she was young, then middle-aged, and finally to right before the end. She turned to face me and smiled before she faded away. My mother struggled with the loss, but managed to pull through. We were tested now our matriarch was gone. A group of armed witch hunters attacked the family home. I had no qualms about taking lives now. This was a matter of survival. They came when the full moon faded, hoping to strike with the declining power. There were 7 of them. Their ages ranged from being a teenager, my age, and equivalent, all the way up to 50 years. They looked at me with hatred in their eyes. A burning hatred. They were armed with incredibly mortal weapons, guns and knives, and they circled the house. 3 of them came to the front door. The 2 heads vibrated and sent us warnings. In this circumstance, neither form of our goddess would act. It was a bloody battle. My mother perished in the conflict, and 4 of their number died. I was too drained, too wounded to carry on. So each side took our dead and our wounded. No truce was given, and I figured they thought I was doomed anyway, without my family. I lay her body at the feet of the Queen of Night's statue, and the goddess stepped through and took her soul into her keeping. You must pledge yourself to the Queen of Night, my child. This is why. This is our story. Like your sister before you, you have a lot to accomplish. The door's hinges broke as they were kicked, and the statue's eyes glowed. I looked down at my wrinkled hands, weathered and marked from a lifetime in battle. I looked at my daughters and granddaughters surrounding me with pride. We will destroy the witch hunters. I hope you enjoy this story. What did you think of it? Let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. Don't forget to stab the like button, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment. This video is made with the support of my incredible channel members, Patreon subscribers, and all my viewers. Thank you so much for supporting me. Don't forget to check out my social media accounts below, including my merch. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.